right, so yesterday we were looking at a very important year in the Vietnam War. It's the year that the Tet Offensive happens in the beginning of '68, January, okay? And then when Nixon gets elected in '68, he says he's going to bring us an end to the war, but with honor, right? So that means for everybody who heard that, victory, okay? Only for Nixon, he's going to try to define victory on a new set of terms. So if you look at Vietnamization, it's kind of like where we were when the war started. Vietnamization is the effort to have the Vietnamese in South Vietnam do the fighting, right? Not us. And he's going to withdraw 500,000 troops ultimately. I mean, 500,000, that's a huge number. And you're going to see the end of the official draft in 68, 69 with a lottery. And that was based on your birthday, and they would draw like a number. And if it equated to your birth date and year, then you were drafted. But that meant a whole lot less people were getting drafted. And that was positive, you know. But he also began bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and you know that was secret. Keep that in mind. So some reporters, particularly the New York Times, was writing sort of like rumor or reports coming out of Phnom Penh are that in the countryside bombs are exploding. You know, but you had to be in the sort of Cambodian jungle to actually know this was happening, and Westerners were not hiking up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So there was no official knowledge of this yet. Okay, and they were also using this toxic defoliant, this basically Roundup. That made so many of our soldiers and Vietnamese soldiers sick and civilians. Now, this does not come to light in '68. So in some ways, this is tricky, but it is number 6 on your Nixon Vietnamizes the war. So in '68, you have an event. Now, later on, this is going to become public. Like the American people are going to find out about it. But what happened was you have this Charlie company that is going out on seek and destroy missions. That's what they were called when they would go into villages trying to find the Viet Cong. A couple of the unit's like favorite soldiers, guys that were like popular, had actually been massacred as scouts. They were butchered, and the unit was very, very upset. Like as a whole, morale was very low. That's not an excuse; it's an explanation. And they are pumping into this village called My Lai. That's how you pronounce that, My Lai. And they herd the entire village into a ditch, into like a road that's kind of laying there. And then they start shooting at them in the ditch. Yeah, it's terrible. This is a war crime, really. Because these are children and old people and stuff. A helicopter pilot lands his helicopter between the American soldiers and the Vietnamese civilians who are getting shot at. So he stops them from doing this, basically. Now, there will become a court-martial, a trial of this guy, Lieutenant Calley, and he'll be found guilty of orchestrating this massacre. Now, many people who studied this event consider him a scapegoat, because what it makes it seem like is he's the guy who did this, and that's it. It's like a singular experience. Right. And it turns out that these kind of, not on this scale, but where villagers have been killed by Americans had happened before. And so it was thought to be known sort of like throughout the army that this kind of stuff went on. And so when it becomes publicized, the My Lai massacre, keep in mind, a lot of Americans are now kind of reluctantly either opposing the war or not necessarily supporting it anymore. And the more of these sort of bad news stories that come out, the less enthusiastic we'll be about it. And I show you this to point out, not that the American soldiers who fought in Vietnam were baby killers or terrible people, but that at times Americans did terrible things in the war in Vietnam. Of course, Vietnamese did terrible things in the war in Vietnam. And, we're going to learn a lot of lessons from this war that in our next major war, we're not going to do again. But this is going to be some people consider this the war in which America loses its innocence. The idea that we could be the bad guys to some people, and that's really unfortunate. Now, the anti-war demonstration are going to superheat after the discovery. It comes to light that Nixon has not only bombed Cambodia, he's ordering troops into Cambodia. So they're invading Cambodia. And when this happens, when this stuff comes to light, the protest movement kicks up again. And it starts on several campuses, but you had a group of students who were marching on their campus in Ohio at the university called Kent State. The governor of Ohio calls in the National Guard, for whatever reason, I've read it and I don't understand it to this day, the National Guard are carrying live ammunition loaded in their guns. Like, in other words, they're going to respond to the protesters with the presence of armed weapons, right? Well, this is a situation where the tear gas was used, right? But it's kind of cryptic, kind of like the Boston Massacre, where you're not really sure if one soldier got a rock thrown at him or was provoked and fired around, or if a shot was fired just as an accident, you know. And next thing you know, the guardsmen, who are the same age as the students. That's one of the things that's really sad when you think about it. Like, these are 19 and 20 and 21-year-olds shooting at 19 and 20 and 21-year-olds in this field. And one of the kids killed was an ROTC man, I think. He wasn't even protesting. He was like walking to class. And so it's just like a terrible event. And it also happened on a week later on the campus of Jackson State down in Mississippi, where they fired on a dorm. And, you know, Americans were stunned to see American kids being killed on American campus. I mean, it's just like, what on earth is happening? The musician from Canada, Neil Young, was part of a band called Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And he'll go into the Canadian woods and come out an hour later with a song called Ohio, which is a protest song of this, you know, of the killing of Kent State. It's a really interesting song. But this picture is very famous. There's an article about this young woman that was just out the other day. She's still alive, and it was talking about her reaction to, I don't remember if it was her boyfriend or a friend getting shot, and that's who's laying there in the street. Really sadly, that picture. And this is a period in history where pictures change people's perception. So in other words, once these pictures show up, either the napalm young girl or stuff like this, you know, even if this isn't normal, this is the image you see. And the image is much more powerful than like necessarily even everything else. So no Kent State, which was a response. Okay, now the Congress begins to move to try to rein in the war. Do you guys remember Senator Fulbright and the Foreign Relations Committee? You need to know Senator Fulbright. The Foreign Relations Committee has been sort of scrutinizing the war the whole time and has not been highly enthusiastic as the war has progressed. And during 1970, they're going to pass a repeal of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. But because the House doesn't pass it, the war continues. Okay? They will also, with Nixon's support, pass the 26th Amendment, which lowers the voting age to 18 nationwide. The right to vote will be 18. Sadly, in the first election in which these people can vote, less than 50% of people under the age of 21 vote. So McGovern, the guy who runs in 72, was hoping for the youth vote. It never shows up. Young people have not voted much at all until President Obama's election in 2008. Okay, so that was the first time youth in any real number voted. By 1971, Nixon will abolish the draft. By 73, and to this day, we have an all-volunteer army. So one of the great things that will come out of Vietnam is the recognition that drafting people for an unpopular war is not a good decision. You understand? Particularly if the draft is highly divisive in terms of who is drafted and who isn't. I didn't mention for sure, I think, but understand that a deferment means that the draft board, and you have what we're called local draft boards, makes a decision that you should not be draft eligible. Now, you can be deferred for physical reasons, like health reasons, or you know, some sort of flat foot or inability to see. But a lot of the deferments came to people who had corporate jobs and were young, like college graduates who were in their early 20s who would have been drafted, were in you know, companies instead. Now, another thing that's really terrible about the Vietnam War is it's the first war that I know of, and maybe the only war, where the veterans who were, keep in mind, they had a 12-month deployment, and they pretty much were in combat and in country almost that whole time. When they returned, a lot of times they would fly into big cities like New York or to San Francisco or LA, well, I shouldn't say New York, West Coast, so LA. And the anti-war protesters would be there at the airport and would spit on them and would protest them and call them baby killers. And I think it's one of the most shameful periods in our lives as a nation, where the country that we live in, people within our country, protested the soldiers themselves. You mind, these are soldiers who get drafted or volunteer to serve their country. You know, it's not their job to ask why we're fighting. It's our job to ask why we're fighting. You know, it's our job as American citizens to question our government. It's not our job to belittle or attack the people who serve their country. And that happened in the 60s, which I consider a really shameful moment, you know, for Americans to do that. But, you know, it happened nonetheless. And so a lot of these times, and so our veterans of Vietnam for an entire generation were frequently not well received, you know, and by that I mean, even at like the VFW, you know, if you went to the VFW or American Legion, you know, our World War II and Korean veterans would kind of look down on the Vietnam veterans because they were seen as like the guys who lost the war. But by the 90s, that attitude has changed. By today, certainly, you know, when we look at our Vietnam veterans, we're grateful for their service, regardless if the motive for keeping the war going was, you know, inappropriate or wrong. That should not matter at all as far as who served in the war. And I hope you guys understand that about veterans in general. Okay. So another thing, gosh, you know, it seems like it all came pouring out once Nixon got elected, and very little of it was directly related to him. But this one is going to start Nixon down the path of darkness. This was his one of the things that angered him the absolute most. So what we're looking at is called the Pentagon Papers. Okay. And the Pentagon Papers were actually a series of a study. President Johnson and Kennedy had commissioned a study to understand the history of the Vietnam War through the RAND Corporation. So the RAND Corporation, like my cousin worked for Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a corporation that handles the numbers for the Defense Department. They're like their accountants and number crunchers. So there are companies that actually just work for the Defense Department. And one of those was the RAND Corporation, which stands for Research and Development. And one of their employees was a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, right? And Ellsberg was sort of like the Eric Snowden of his day, if you understand that analogy. He knew that the government of our country, that President Kennedy and President Johnson had misled the American public, like particularly about the events around the Gulf of Tonkin, for example. So he knew that there was dishonest stuff, particularly about the Johnson administration. And so he got this large cache of documents and snuck them out, right? Which is, you know, violating his confidentiality and clearance. And then he leaked them to the New York Times. And Nixon sues the New York Times to stop the publication of this, okay? And Nixon loses. The Supreme Court looks at the information and says, this is history. This information happened 10, 12, 15 years ago.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, my Siri lately. Sorry, guys. So anyway, Nixon says that this violates our national security, the disclosure of this information. The Supreme Court looks at it and says, no, you know, this isn't our current ongoing operations. This is a decade ago or more now. And so they allow the Times to run this. There's a newspaper, I mean, there's a movie about this pretty good too. The Washington Post will also run this, okay? So once this happens and the public are notified that by the time Johnson was president, this isn't about fighting communism anymore. It's about not losing. All right, and so that really ended public support for the Vietnam War on a large scale. Now here's where Nixon's genius pays off. And, you know, I said this started Nixon down the dark road. So what I should tell you is Richard Nixon is furious about this. Now, you might think you'd be like, cool, it's throwing, you know, shade on Johnson, right? It's the leaking of information, right? It's the leaking of top secret information from the government to the press, who Nixon could not stand the media. He hated the fake news of his day, so to speak. He hated the press. He felt like the press was trying to crucify him, like it was a personal vendetta. So what he does, so keep in mind, what we call when information gets out of the government to the press, it's called a leak, right? Yep. So who do you hire to fix a leak? Say louder. A plumber, right? So Nixon is going to have his White House create a group of former CIA agents, okay, to deal with leaks. So they'll become known as the plumbers unit. So they'll investigate people, dig up dirt on them. And so what they're going to do, for example, with Ellsberg, is they're going to break into his psychiatrist's office and try to get information on him that will discredit this report. You understand? So it's after the Pentagon Papers that the plumbers are created. And the plumbers are the guys who get caught at Watergate. You understand? That's the connection. So it's the use of secret people breaking the law to find out information to blackmail or coerce people, right? So that's where this stuff starts. Well, they went to jail. One of them will later have his own radio show in Virginia and run for the Senate. So, it's funny how life works.
Also, question: why is it called Nixon sued the New York Times?
The Times sued Nixon. Well, Nixon stopped, told them they couldn't print it. They sued him to get permission to print it. So in other words, you can't, a newspaper can't publish something if the government says is top secret. That violate. That's the only freedom of the press that has a limit to it. So in this case, Nixon versus it's U.S. versus Times, right? Let me check that. U.S. versus. Is it New York Times versus Nixon? What do I have up there? I think I might have put that right. New York Times versus U.S. Yeah. So this was both them and the Post. So there's a movie called The Post about this. He used executive authority to not allow the Times, to force the Times to suspend. The question was a freedom of the press case. The Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment did protect the Times. So he stopped them and the Times sued them. Okay, so I got my order a little bit backwards there, but you get the idea is that they weren't allowing the New York Times to proceed or the Post. And the Times we're doing it anyway, right? And then the Times we'll go to court over to have the right to print. Okay, so that's why. And the Supreme Court ruled they did have it. So although this is going to turn Nixon to the dark side, so to speak, Nixon is probably one of the greatest presidents we've ever had with knowledge of foreign policy. So keep in mind, Nixon has spent 30 years studying other countries. He is an absolutely brilliant figure in foreign policy and diplomacy. The man with him there is also absolutely brilliant, and that is Henry Kissinger, who will be his national security advisor and at the end of his presidency, the Secretary of State. So Henry Kissinger is an absolutely brilliant scholar of foreign history. He had written his PhD on Metternich. You guys remember Metternich and the Congress of Vienna and the post-Napoleonic period of diplomacy and balance of power. So he was an absolute brilliant figure on this. So these two guys have been studying the world and are thinking, what's the best way to extricate ourselves from Vietnam and to bring down some of the tension of the Cold War? And so what Nixon and Kissinger recognized is that Mao is not friends with Brezhnev or Khrushchev or the Soviets. Right. The Soviets have been kind of pushing the Chinese, trying to tell them what to do. And Mao has bristled at that. He doesn't like that. He doesn't like being second fiddle or, the kind of sidekick to the Soviet Union. And this is something that Nixon and Kissinger recognize. And so Nixon is going to be the first president to ever do this. And it's absolutely astonishing. He is going to travel to China, communist China, which we didn't even recognize usually, right? And he's going to give formal recognition to China, communist China, you understand, not nationalist China. And he is going to meet with Mao and with Zhou Enlai. That's Zhou Enlai in the background, who was the premier of China under Mao. And he's going to work out some negotiations and discussions with them. And particularly, it's unusual that Nixon did this because Nixon is the most vehement figure of anti-communism in American history at that time. Keep in mind, McCarthy's dead. And so Nixon was the leader of HUAC who pursued communism. That's why Nixon can do this. No one is going to accuse Richard Nixon of being soft on communism. So when he goes and travels to China, he's using that to drive a wedge between the two great communist powers. If you can split those two up, then you triangulate. And so rather than being us against them two, it's us and them. And this absolutely works. And so we call this détente. It's the French word for relaxation. So it's like relaxed tensions between us and the Chinese and the Soviets. And so Nixon pulls this off. He's also doing this. If we can get a little more chummy with the Chinese, maybe they won't interfere when we do something in Vietnam, right? Because that's always been out there as the threat of China. But if China sees the possibility of trade with America or getting along with America, they might be willing to back off on Vietnam, right? And to make sure that China understands we're serious about this, Nixon then meets with Brezhnev in Moscow. All right, so we hang out with Brezhnev, and he is going to negotiate the first two treaties with the Soviet Union of the Cold War. So you need to know these two treaties, okay? These two treaties, by the way, are the sort of absolute specific example of détente, all right? Now, I will point out that one of the things that the Soviets need is grain. They're having wheat and food shortages, and they really need some. And Nixon trades them some. He said, all right, we'll give you guys grain if you'll talk to us. And so by doing this, he is going to make them a little more sympathetic of us, right? So it's kind of like saying, we'll talk to China. And now the Soviets, who are inherently distrustful, are like, well, we don't want them talking to China. We should talk to them, right? And then Chinese see us talking to the Soviets. They're like, they're talking to the Soviets? We need to talk to them more. So it's putting the Soviets against the Chinese instead of the two of them against us, right? So that's brilliant. And it worked. You know, it thaws the tension of the Cold War. And so what these two treaties are, so I'd like you to know these two treaties, okay? The first is SALT, and SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Strategic Arms Limitation. That means not making as many nukes as we were making. We're going to limit the number of nukes we can make. SALT, Strategic Arms Limitations. So we agree with Brezhnev, and that's the new leader of the Soviet Union. He'll be one of the last ones. So we negotiate this with him, and then we negotiate also, same series of negotiations, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. So what the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty is, ABM, is an agreement to not try to develop weapons that will shoot down missiles. Anti-ballistic, you understand? So, because keep in mind, if we develop a means of shooting down their missiles, then what will they do? They will, but what else will they do? They'll make a missile that will avoid the things that we use to shoot down their missiles. So what will that kick off a new round of? Another arms race, right? It'll be even more racing. So by both sort of multilaterally agreeing to not try to shoot down each other's weapons, we don't make new systems. However, you know, I say all that tongue firmly planted in cheek, we do make new weapons, because what we do is we take our missile system, even the Air Force is the guys that are running these ICBMs, and we MIRV them. And MIRVs, if you haven't studied nuclear missiles, are, if you look at the top, so what you do is you fire a missile. As the missile reaches its destination, the warhead is actually 6 or 8 warheads, and then they all come out of that one missile. And so it like rains down 8 nuclear bombs out of one missile. So while we may be making less missiles, we have more bombs in the missile. And that's why it's called multiple independent reentry vehicle. So there are multiple warheads on one missile. So that kind of, in one way, ratchets up the Cold War. You know, it sounds weird, but we're not making more missiles, we're making better missiles, as you might say, or better warheads, or scarier, depending on how you look at it. So I would know what MIRV means, and I would know the SALT and ABM treaties as well. So all of this, if Nixon doesn't do Watergate, right, he gets, I would imagine, the Nobel Peace Prize for this, you know, because this is the beginning of the end of the Cold War. They're like getting along with the Russians, getting along with the Chinese, you know, and that would have been great. Unfortunately, Nixon is not quite as useful, I think, when it came to Latin America. Most notably, what we did in support down in Chile. Okay, so we did not literally invade Chile, but we backed Pinochet in his overthrow of Allende. And Pinochet was an absolute brutal, brutal dictator, one of the worst in the Western Hemisphere's history. So down in Latin America, if you know where Chile is, they had a Marxist leftist president named Salvador Allende. And, you know, we can't have that. CIA's not letting that happen. So we get him outed, and we put in Augusto Pinochet. Let me see where his name is. After a coup d'etat, keeps Chile from, yeah. So we keep Allende out. Well, you may not have to know Pinochet. His name is down here. It looks like Pinochet. Okay, so he's going to be the far right reactionary president of Chile for a while, and he's also going to be an interesting president for for free market capitalists, because he's going to allow sort of Randian Chicago school types to come to his dictatorship and set up the absolutely deregulated free market. So one of the interesting things about this dictator is he's like the ultimate libertarian when it came to free markets. So if you're ever curious about what a unregulated free market looks like, that was Chile during this period. But he was a brutal, repressive dictator to leftists. So it's kind of the trade-off is that we get these tough guys. They're not communists, but they're not nice guys either. And America's history has been pretty good. How many of these types we've avoided? Now, let's go ahead, and I've given you in your information here quite a bit on the Supreme Court. And then I realize that you don't have to know all of these cases, but you do need to know some of them. So I give my AP government students a collection of Supreme Court cases throughout all the history that you should be familiar with, and some of these are going to be on this list. So let's take a look at a few. My list is in the order of your book, not the order of chronology. So my fault there. But let's look at Engel versus Vitale. So these are many, and by no means all, of the decisions under Chief Justice Earl Warren. So remember, Brown v. Board happened back in '54, right? So fast forward a decade, and you're going to see under the Justice Warren's court, Chief Warren's court, the most liberal decisions in history. So this is why historians consider this the most progressive or liberal Supreme Court ever. All right. So let's look at one of the things they do. One of the things they do is they stop the school-sponsored prayer. So this is a case where you had an ACLU parent sue their school because their child was having to hear either the principal or I think it was the teacher lead the class in prayer every morning. So it was a school official was giving a school-led prayer. And what the Supreme Court under Warren said is that violates the separation of church and state. It violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment because your teacher and your principal are government officials, and you are mandated by the government to come to school, right? And then if you have to be confronted or present during a sectarian, a religious prayer that you don't agree with, that is imposing religious beliefs on you. And so that's Engel versus Vitale, which is like the fifth bullet down there on the list. Just simplest way to read it is school-led prayer. So school-led prayer. Now, it doesn't outlaw prayer in schools. I'll hear people say that sometimes. I've seen many a kid pray silently right before an exam, right? That's not illegal. You can totally pray in school. You just can't be led in prayer as a school practice, meaning I can't teach you, I can't pray with you, so to speak, as a teacher. Okay? Same thing with Abington. It just took it to, you can't require Bible reading in school. You can't require it, as a part of a devotional activity. Now, I can show you verses that are relevant to the teaching of religion, but, that's from a secular perspective, not from a, teaching it to you, not that kind of way. Okay. Now, Gideon is the beginning of what critics will call this coddling criminals. I don't necessarily agree with that. I'm all for civil liberties. And part of the problem was in the Constitution, in the Fifth Amendment and Sixth Amendment, you have the right to an attorney. That's in there. It's guaranteed. The problem is, what if you're low income? Only after Gideon is the state required to provide you with one. So before this, there was no like necessary requirement to give you a lawyer. It says you have a right to a lawyer. It doesn't mean you have the right to afford a lawyer, right? Well, that's what this says. Gideon said, now don't confuse this with Miranda. Miranda is the notification that you have the right to an attorney, right? Gideon is you have a right to an attorney if you cannot afford one, period. So this is where we think of things like public defenders, public defenders, government-sponsored defense attorneys. Reynolds versus Sims is a great decision, I think, in terms of establishing the principle of one person, one vote. So what that means is you'll hear people in our part of the county, our part of the country, of the state, I'll get it right in a minute, complain that we only have like one congressman for all our area, right? But we're not old parliament. We don't get our congressmen based on square miles. Because there are lots of areas in America where there are thousands of square miles and hardly any people. Our representative system is based on the number of people. So what that means here in Virginia is we have 3 congressional districts in the western part of the state and 8 in the eastern part. That's because that's where people live. So the idea of Reynolds is you have to create your districts in a manner that is equal in representation for every district. So you can't have like 100,000 people here and 50,000 people here, and they have the same number of votes, right? That's not equal. So that's why it's called one man, one vote. Your book doesn't mention Escobedo, and that is an oversight because Escobedo is a huge case connected with both Gideon and Miranda. Escobedo establishes what we call the exclusionary rule, and I would like you to know this in general. The exclusionary rule means if you have not been notified of your right to an attorney, if you have not had your, if due process has not been followed by law enforcement, then any evidence they obtained is inadmissible. So you understand what it's excluded. So if you search someone without a search warrant, not evidence that's acceptable, right? Because of this case, Escobedo. So this is the kind of case that law enforcement officers have to abide by the law. Like that's not rocket science. Like they have to obey the Constitution too. They're not. No one's outside of the law, particularly not law enforcement. So you have to, you have to follow this. And as you can probably guess, all of this is leading to you need to be notified of this, right? Because a lot of Americans, Hispanic or otherwise, didn't know that these were their rights. Now, ignorance of your rights doesn't mean you still don't have them. So that sets the stage for, where is it? Right there. So if you're following up, if you see the line of reasoning here, Gideon, Escobedo, Miranda. And the Miranda case is the case determining that you have to be notified of your right to an attorney, of your right to remain silent. Your right to remain silent is part of Escobedo. Yes, it's in the Constitution, All right, so I would be familiar with those 3 cases together. Now let's take a look at Griswold. And Griswold is a huge case because it's one of my favorites. You have the right to privacy, right? Now, again, lots of debate about do we have a right to privacy? Originalists will say it's not in the Bill of Rights. Loose interpretation, people will say, wait a minute, what's the 9th Amendment for if it's not in the Bill of Rights? You guys remember what the 9th Amendment says? No? Nobody knows the 9th Amendment? Yeah, unenumerated rights. You have more rights than are stated here, specifically. And the 4th Amendment is particularly useful because that's the one that requires a search warrant. That's the one that requires probable cause, right? So the idea of privacy is now it's permeated through the American society. We have medical privacy rights. We have educational privacy rights. We want to have internet rights to privacy, right? I know. But one of the most important outcomes of this, you do not get Roe v. Wade, which most everybody's heard of, if you don't have Griswold versus Connecticut. Estelle Griswold was a woman who wanted to notify people of their right to have contraception. The state of Connecticut said you can't send through the mail about birth control at all. And women can't get birth control. They're going to prohibit the use of birth control, or they did prohibit the use of it. And she said, what I do in the privacy of my own home should not be the state's business. And the Supreme Court agreed. Warren Court said, yeah, you're right. So today, whenever you hear the culture wars about courts, if you ask a judge, do you believe in the right to privacy? Then pretty much, you're not going to repeal Roe v. Wade. Because how else do you find out if somebody's having an abortion but violating their privacy, right? And this is part of the problem for anybody who wants to overturn this. That means you have to go to the foundation of that case and pull it out. And nobody in America seriously considers wanting to have their educational privacy taken or their medical privacy taken, right? Like these are your rights. So Griswold was a huge case. I mean, just massive. Be familiar with that. New York Times versus Sullivan. Times printed a mistake. Papers make errors. They were sued. It turns out they had mistakenly said this they thought their information was sound, and that meant they were not guilty of libel. So libel, which is like speaking ill and wrong of someone falsely, is only libel if you know it's false. That means the press can't be sued all the time. And so, the Times didn't commit reckless disregard. So It's more freedom of the press, I guess the best way to interpret that. Now, I didn't put Heart of Atlanta in it's not in the book, but it's another case I want you to know because it's the very first case about the Civil Rights Act. And I mean, look at the year, 64, right? The Civil Rights Act was passed in 64. So down in Georgia and Atlanta, you had a small motel. And I mean small, like, kind of bed and breakfast kind of thing for people. And they sued saying that Congress had no authority to tell them who they could let stay in their house, in their hotel or motel. Congress has no authority, they said, over whether or not they discriminate or not, because they're a local motel, right? So if you were back during the Depression, the Supreme Court would have agreed with them. You remember the Schechter sick chicken case? In the Schechter case, the Supreme Court ruled that a local poultry company should not be under the whims of the National Recovery Administration, this huge program, because it was too local in character. So that's what these guys are suing. They're saying you can't force me to integrate when I'm a local motel. You don't have the authority to do that. And so the government under Johnson defended this under the Commerce Clause. So this is the case when the Commerce Clause takes on a whole new meaning. So the last time we talked about the Commerce Clause seriously, we were talking about like steamboats and railroads, right? So you had the steamboat case. You guys remember Gibbons versus Ogden? Maybe way back during the 1820s, during John Marshall's presidency. Or you may recall that you can't regulate interstate railroads, right? Anybody remember Wabash case? Very good. Well, this is the first time the Supreme Court says you can regulate. Because if people are coming in your door as a public accommodation, they could very well be from out of state. And thus they're what? Interstate commerce. Now commerce is people. So down the road is Mills Grocery, right? Not too much interstate commerce going in there, is it? Probably a local character, but they're regulated by the Civil Rights Act. Local doesn't really apply anymore. So what the government is going to do from the 60s on is basically say, well, we can regulate anything because what's anything? It's interstate commerce, particularly once the internet is developed.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So if you're wondering how the government is going to try to regulate guns, here it is. It's a debate between the Commerce Clause and the Second Amendment, right? Yeah, perhaps. Now, I will tell you this. I'm going to give you a fast forward and tell you that there has been some restraint on this Commerce Clause in recent years. A couple of years back during the Clinton administration, we had a law passed that was a law designed to prevent firearms in schools. Okay? It was a law prohibiting guns to be in school. Okay? And an individual was found to have a gun in their possession on school properties. And they sued saying, how can the federal government prevent me from having a gun in my glove compartment or in my trunk or in my vehicle? Or even if I want to carry it in a high school, how can they regulate that? Like, where's the power of the federal government to regulate me carrying a gun in schools or on parking lots? Gun-Free Schools Act is what it's called. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you know what? You're right. That's not regulating commerce. There's no commercial transaction when you carry a firearm from point A to point B. It's not like you're selling it, right? You're just carrying it, And so your school can prohibit it. Your state can prohibit it. But guess who can't prohibit it? The federal government can't prohibit it. So that was one of the first laws in recent years to restrain this really, really broad interpretation of commerce. So the movement of human beings isn't commerce necessarily, but if they're engaged in a commercial activity, it's commerce. That makes sense? Here's another one, how the government can regulate abortion. Do you pay money to get abortions? It's commerce, right? So anything that involves money basically is commercial, or even the exchange of goods and services. So that's an interesting law and certainly an interesting case, the Heart of Atlanta case. So is the Civil Rights Act constitutional? Yes, says Heart of Atlanta. All right. Now you can see here some other cases like the banning of, you cannot ban the teaching of evolution. Remember when we went back and we talked about the Scopes monkey trial, right? So, and then here's a free speech case where two high school students wore peace armbands to school. And they were suspended for that, and they sued over their right to protest. And this is what we call symbolic speech, meaning if you wear something on your clothing, that's speech. If you burn a flag, this court will say later, that's speech, right? And so this is probably the broadest interpretation of freedoms in American history. As somebody who believes in civil liberties and freedom, I'm all for it. All right. But that means the people have to operate with restraint. Therein lies the problem. Remember what Madison said. If men were angels, we would have no need of government, right? So we're not angels, y'all. So anywho, Nixon is furious about all this stuff, right? As is the right, the conservative right, particularly the religious right. Like a lot of this stuff feels like secularizing and taking God out of schools, right? So he is intent on replacing that court with a much more conservative court. Right? Nixon appoints 4 justices, all of which he thinks are conservatives. Only one of them are conservative. The rest of them are liberal. That's right. So you're going to have 3 of the most liberal members of the court who were moderates in public, but once they're on the court, you can't get rid of them, right? And so their true colors came out. Now, who was the one conservative? William Rehnquist. Rehnquist will later become, under Ronald Reagan, Chief Justice. And he will be, at one point, the only conservative on the entire Supreme Court. So it'll be 8-1, like a bunch of votes. All right. So Berger turns out to be relatively as liberal as Warren. Almost as liberal. So you're going to have the Berger court, and they're going to do a whole bunch of stuff that's going to look similar. All right. For example, they're going to determine the Berger, here's his own Supreme Court, basically. They're going to tell him he can't stop the Pentagon Papers from being published. All right. You're going to see here the Lemon test, which really takes religion out of government more, so to speak. Like it cannot entangle itself with government. But of course, the case that they're also going to rule the death penalty unconstitutional for a minute. They later repeal that. But the case, of course, you absolutely have to know for this class is Roe v. Wade. Okay? Roe v. Wade. So definitely be familiar with this case. Obviously, a lot of people have heard of it. But the key that you have to recognize is how far away we are from it today. So if you were to look at Roe and its original framework, Roe, by the way, is a female John Doe. So it's a pseudonym for an anonymous person, Jane Roe. The irony of it all is Roe had her child and later became a pro-life activist, right? An anti-abortion activist. And then later renounced that she was an anti-abortion activist and said she was paid off to do that. So that lady has had a weird history. Norma Jean McCovey, I think is her name. But anyway, if you look at what the court said, it's pretty fascinating. They set very strict trimester guidelines. So, this is not a class on how pregnant women progress, but if you're unaware, basically there's a 9-month period. Each have 3 months called a trimester. So take a look at it. No state interference in the first trimester. So in the first 3 months of pregnancy, the government cannot prohibit any form of abortion, right? So the first 3 months. Second 3 months, they may regulate it to protect the health of the mother, right? So if abortion threatens the health of the mother, they can, restrict it, regulate it, whatever. That's the theory, okay? But in the third trimester, they may regulate it to protect the health of the unborn child. A lot of people don't know that part. So it's the third trimester prohibited what we now call late-term abortions or partial birth abortions. Later on, there will be another Supreme Court case that it's called Atkinson. We'll get to it another day. They throw out the trimester framework and basically say the state cannot put any undue burden on abortion, right? So you're going to see an expansion of abortion rights later in history, in the 80s particularly. There have been 3 major cases regarding abortion since Roe v. Wade. None of them have prohibited. Some of them have allowed restrictions, but we've been through a myriad of courts now, and you can see the case is now 50 years old. I think people who think Roe v. Wade is going to be reversed have a very tough struggle here, because what's at the foundation of Roe is Griswold. Griswold is the right of privacy. And so unless someone can brilliantly argue that the right of privacy doesn't exist, in this case, then they're not going to be able to make it stick. And, since these cases have been established, this has pretty much been the rule, and we're there now. So that was obviously something religious folks particularly were very much against. Women were very grateful, women who were pro-choice, because now states like Texas, which is where Roe was from, cannot prohibit abortion, right? So that's been the sort of pro-choice, pro-life debate is how much can it be restricted, over the last 50 years, not can it be outlawed altogether. So that's where we are today. So during Watergate, President Nixon is going to claim executive privilege. And Congress, I mean, the Supreme Court, Warren Burger's court's going to say you can claim executive privilege, but not in the Watergate investigation because that's criminal in nature. So you can't use executive privilege to cover up abuse of power or criminal activity. And that's an interesting check on Nixon.
How about Reed versus Reed? Did a wife sue her husband?
No, this had to do with when an estate is being granted. Right. You don't get to say, well, the man gets a whole lot more than the woman. Right. Because of the sex difference. So yes, this was more of a gender equality case. Right. Exactly. No sexual discrimination in estate inheritance and stuff like that. Right. It's interesting. Yeah. Now, here you can see the busing case. This is not a liberal ruling, and it's the first real slap at civil rights activists. They would consider this. So in this case, you can't compare. Like the example I would give you is let's look at the Tunstall School District. Our school district, in terms of student population, is probably about 86% white, give or take. Okay. Let's say Chatham is more like 54% white. So that's obviously different. And we're in the same county. So if the central office wanted to get more, quote, equality, right, they could take, let's say, 15% of the students from Chatham that are African American and send them here, right, and send some of our white students there in order to achieve more equality. The Supreme Court said that's ridiculous. That's called forced busing, by the way. It's like busing you a long ways to get racial parity, right? They said that where you live is where your school should be, right? And that this is completely like non-discriminatory. In other words, like if black people live down the road, they live in Tunstall District. If white people, so where you live is where your school should be. And you should not use some sort of strategy that's because it discriminates against the people who are being forced somewhere else, white or black, out of their own school district. So this was an attempt to try to like have more integrated schools, i.e., white and black communities melded. And the court said you can't artificially do that because it's discriminatory. That's like saying you have to move outside of your own district. That is going to mean more and more people are going to decide where to live based on schools. So like people build their houses and settle in communities where they know what the school body is like, particularly racially. Other case. Oh, here's the case where they brought back the death penalty. Georgia, it was outlawed, and then they brought it back. Let's write down Bakke. Now, Bakke is mentioned somewhere else in this chapter, but I definitely would like you to know Bakke. What you had, and this is a case that whenever I hear people talk about affirmative action. So, what's ironic about Nixon, here's this Republican guy, he institutes quota-based affirmative action, one of the most highly disliked things amongst white people I've ever heard of. So when these companies and colleges are establishing their quotas, the government is telling them you have to accept like 12% or whatever the ratio was. Bakke sues the University of California and says, if you are creating a quota system so that more black students get enrolled, and I'm actually more eligible than a black student who gets in, that's discriminatory. And the Supreme Court says, you're right, that's discriminatory. You cannot solve discrimination by being more discriminatory. So in other words, quotas, where you say race gets a higher number, a higher value because they're a minority, is discriminatory against white people. And so we call this reverse discrimination, and it's illegal. And so whenever I hear people moaning about losing their job to somebody or not getting a job they want, I'm like, well, if an employer does this, it's discriminatory. If you lost your job to somebody, quote, your job to somebody who was more eligible, that's your problem. That's tough luck. But if a company has established quotas based on race, where they're going to say, like, we got to have 10% of our employees be this, that's considered discrimination. That's right. So colleges don't do this. Now, colleges are allowed to take race into consideration in terms of, as part of the big picture, because guys, I ain't gonna lie to you, y'all would not get to get in any of the competitive colleges if there was no differentiation, because Northern Virginia kids carry a much heavier pedigree in their transcript. You understand? They have better records than we do. They have more classes that are better. They have more opportunities than ours. But in state of Virginia school system, every locality in the state region has some guaranteed positions because we pay taxes there. You understand? We pay taxes, so our students get to go to UVA and William and Mary and Tech too. Otherwise, schools would look a lot more Asian American than they actually statistically are, because those are the kids that outperform currently, right? So it's an interesting development. All right. And here is a case where you're going to see the homosexual rights have not been, were not secure during the 80s. So in Texas and Georgia, both, they had laws prohibiting gay sexual relations. Okay, period. And the Supreme Court upheld that. And to me, that's just as much violating the right of privacy as it is for anything else. Well, gay people were discriminated against during this period.
So it's discrimination.
Yeah. So 20 years later, the court's going to reverse that case. All right. So today, these are no longer the case. But at the time, that shows you that most of what we consider normal in America now or whatever wasn't, I mean, normal years ago. Years ago, I would wear a suit and tie to work, right? So I look like a hippie tree hugger or something, or a guy should be in Hawaii. But the point is that change is gradual. And usually people will not accept radical change. That's one thing about the 60s and even here. So I agree that this was not, in my mind, this was discriminatory, but you know, that was their ruling. Okay. Let's talk about some of the other things about Nixon. So Nixon was actually growing in popularity. He was a pretty popular guy because of his strategies in Vietnam and his fairly liberal social agenda, which we'll get to in a minute. Here you can see him waving his famous 2 V's for victory, you know, the double V. So Nixon was kind of riding on a wave of popularity. He was even so popular for a minute, he was cool. All right. And this is one of the greatest pictures ever taken in the White House. You guys know who the guy on the right is, I hope? That's the king. That's the day the king met the president, right? So that's Elvis. And there's a great story behind this picture. Elvis hated or really disliked the counterculture. Elvis was conservative in his politics, and he really didn't like the 60s hippies. So Elvis was a heavy drug user, but he collected badges, right? Badges from, you know, Tennessee state police officers and, you know, anybody could get his hands on. And one day he was hanging out with a guy in a bar, and the guy had all these girls around him, and he was like, "Hey man, what's your deal?" And, you know, "Hey, well, what's your deal?" And the guy's like this, and he flashed him his badge, and it was a federal narcotics agent badge, right? So the guy was an undercover narcotics cop for the drug enforcement agency. And he said, "I want one of those." All right. And the guy's like, "Well, you know, you have to be a federal officer to get it." So he wrote Nixon a letter and sent it to the White House. Elvis did. I'm not making this up. And then he hand delivered it. I mean, he went to the gate at the White House. You know, this is Washington, D.C. Elvis rolls up in his limo. And so the guy, you know, one of the Secret Service are like, they call it the White House, and they're like, "Elvis Presley's at the gate." And, you know, Nixon's like, "I ain't got time for that." And one of his advisors was like, "Dude, it's Elvis. If you are seen with Elvis, your stock will go up." You know, this is Elvis when he wore the great suits, you know, the big buckles and stuff. So they let Elvis come to the White House. You know, he drops by. And he tells Nixon that he wants to become an undercover drug agent. And Nixon's like, "Well, you're Elvis. You can't really." He said, "That's the whole point. Like, I can hang out with all these people and tell on them that are doing drugs." And so they got Elvis a badge, right? You know, a narc badge. And they take this very famous picture of Nixon and Elvis handshaking. Nixon was so awkward, guys. They wanted to take a picture of him at the beach because Nixon lived at the beach in California. So they got there to take the picture, and he was wearing black wingtip shoes and a suit. And they're like, "We can't take a picture of you at the beach walking around like the president," you know. So he was what we would call back then square, meaning uncool. So anytime he could be, and he knew that, and he resented it because the Kennedys were cool, you know, like people liked the Kennedys. And Nixon's like, "I've done all this great stuff, and nobody likes me." Part of the problem is people did like him, and he was just paranoid. I mean, this guy is going to win the biggest electoral victory in history. And yet he thinks he's not popular. You know, so Nixon I told you it was complicated, guys. If Shakespeare is around, you know, Robin Williams said he'd be Richard IV, you know, this flawed hero or anti-hero. So let's talk about his home front agenda. Now, I do think it's interesting, first of all, who Nixon's principal domestic advisor was. His domestic advisor was a young man at the time from New York. Okay. And he was going to become one day the U.S. Senator from New York, right? And his name was Patrick Moynihan. Good old Irish name there. Patrick Moynihan, I'll show you a picture of him, will go down in history as one of the most liberal senators of all time. And yet here he was, before he was a senator, advising who? Nixon. So take a look at what Nixon does as a domestic policy. Now, he doesn't have a cool name, you know, like New Frontier or anything like that, but we're going to take a look at it. So under Nixon, we expand food stamps, Medicaid, and welfare, aid to families with dependent children. So if you think about the modern welfare state of the 80s and 70s, that was less a product of Johnson than it was a product of Nixon. Like Nixon expanded those programs dramatically. Nixon added to Social Security a new characteristic of Social Security called SSI, which was if you were born disabled. So if you're born blind or you're born with a serious disability, you actually get government assistance. You're the people who help you do. Okay? We call this SSI. He put in COLA increases. So a COLA is a cost of living adjustment. So during the Nixon presidency, lots of inflation, right? Well, under him, Social Security would go up if inflation went up, the amount of payment you got. Now, you don't get a raise in your Social Security, but it does go up if there's inflation.
So that way it balances out.
Theoretically, the problem is it fuels inflation. That's more government money going into
That's true. It goes back up.
Right. It's still inflationary. He will establish a nationwide quota plan for federal business, like businesses interacting with the federal government. So affirmative action, the idea that critics would call affirmative blaction, which I don't like, but you know, the idea to correct that historic injustice to a minority is to guarantee that a certain number will be hired. Well, you know, we just talked about that could be discriminatory, right? And, you know, that happened under him. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, one of the most despised by the right agencies in federal government. It was during the 70s that pollution really became overtly noticed, you know, the destruction of the environment. He created the Occupational Safety Hazard Administration, another, quote, job killer, right? So under Nixon, you have one of the most liberal of all presidents in terms of domestic policy. It's really bizarre. You know, and he did this, I think, because it was popular. These are things that people wanted, at least enough people wanted. And also because he believed in them. Nixon wasn't a terrible guy all the time. You know, it was just when it came to politics, he was so messed up, you know. So
yeah, he was messed up politically, but in terms of his moral compass, it actually lines up pretty well.
Well, I think it's the other way around. I think he was very good politically and he was very immoral. You know, like in other words, his morals decayed rapidly. He didn't do the right thing when he could have. Like when he could have said, yeah, there was a burglary here by people that work in my government. Let's make that public and everybody should know about it. He covered it up and he used the federal government to cover it up. And that was a mistake, you know, a terrible mistake. Now, power is an aphrodisiac, you know, and I think that's what Nixon finally had the ultimate power. He didn't want it in any way threatened. Now, I mentioned the EPA. The EPA is a product of a muckraker. She's not your typical kind of muckraker. She was an environmentalist who was walking around one day in her, I think she lived in like New Hampshire or somewhere in New England, you know, and she noticed that there weren't nearly as many birds as there were when she was growing up. Like there weren't as much bird song and birds. So she started doing some deep dive investigation and figured out that they were dead. And what was happening is the little baby egg, when the eggs were being formed, the shells were too soft and the babies were dying, the chicks. So she started studying why was this the case? Why were baby birds not surviving? It turned out that the chemical that they were using on fruit trees in Maine and New Hampshire and stuff like that was called DDT, right? DDT. It was a pesticide. It's why your apples were so shiny and pretty. Unfortunately, when the worms got it, it didn't kill them right away. And then the birds ingested the worms, right? And it poisoned the birds and it messed up their ability to lay eggs. And so she was very quickly saying, we need to consider all the toxic stuff that's in our country, all the toxic stuff that's killing animals and us. And it's because of her that we have the EPA to some degree and Earth Day. And the environmental movement is sort of the modern environmental movement, not the TR and John Muir movement, is born during this period. You know, and so we think about that particularly now. Now, Nixon is going to really, really violate Republican orthodoxy here. In fact, one of his principal advisors is going to quit as a result of this. So we'll pick up with his use of price controls on Monday. So you guys have a great weekend. I will see you guys on the flip side. I know that was a lot to process, right?